They didn't just forget my graduation night. They rewrote it in real time, live on a 60-inch screen, with hot wings and beer bottles drowning out the only milestone I had ever worked for. Let me be clear, I didn't just walk out of that house. I detonated every quiet, polite version of myself I'd ever let them carve out of me, and I left the pieces scattered behind like shards of the person they never bothered to celebrate. It was supposed to be my night. The one I'd waited for, clawed toward, sacrificed sleep, social life, and any shred of high school joy to earn. While other kids posted selfies in cap and gown, flanked by proud parents and teary-eyed relatives, I was upstairs in my bedroom, zipping up my own dress, pinning my own hair, and realizing no one had even knocked to ask if I was nervous, or excited, or proud. Because downstairs, my parents had a different plan. Super Bowl Sunday. That's what they cared about. Kickoff was more sacred than my diploma. The guest list for their party outnumbered the chairs at my graduation ceremony. And I swear to you, I don't even think they remembered it was the same day. Or maybe they did, and decided the game was just more important. Be back before halftime. My mom had called up the stairs when I left for the auditorium, like I was stepping out for groceries instead of collecting the culmination of 12 years of sacrifice. And don't forget the chips. I stood on that stage and watched other kids point into the crowd, beaming, tears in their eyes. I heard entire rows erupt with cheers for other names. I saw fathers recording with shaky hands, mothers crying with pride. My name got called and a janitor in the back dropped a broom. That was my applause. I didn't take pictures afterward. What was the point? No one was waiting outside the gym with flowers. No one held a sign with my name. I just walked to the parking lot alone and stood in the cold, my tassel blowing sideways in the wind. When I stepped through the front door, it was like walking into a sports bar. The volume on the TV was maxed out. Our living room, the same room where I once had birthday sleepovers, now smelled like a deep fryer. My dad was holding a beer in one hand and wearing a jersey with a player's name he probably couldn't even pronounce. My mom, red lipsticked and apron-clad, tossed nachos into a tray and didn't even look up when I came in. Someone yelled touchdown, and people erupted into cheers. "Hey, babe," my mom said, glancing sideways. "Did you pick up the guac?" I stared at her, still in my graduation dress, still holding my little blue cap in my hand. My cords, my honors pin, my rolled-up program were all there like a costume for a different version of me they never wanted to see. "The guac," I repeated. "Yeah, remember?" I said stop by Rosa's and grab a tub. "You know your uncle loves it." I didn't say anything. I just walked past the crowd, past my uncle with a beer belly and mustard stain already on his shirt, past my aunt who hadn't spoken to me since she told my mom I needed to lose weight for prom, past the neighbors who once told me I was so quiet they forgot I existed. In the hallway mirror, I saw myself. The cords, the pin, the dress I'd bought on clearance and altered myself in secret. I looked like a stranger in my own house, a visitor at someone else's celebration. I walked up the stairs one final time. Every click of my heels on those wood steps was a goodbye. To every night I did dishes while they screamed at refs. To every birthday I shared with playoff season. To every report card I laid on the counter without comment. I wasn't the daughter of that house anymore. I was just the girl who packed too quietly to be noticed. My suitcase was under the bed, exactly where I left it a year ago when I first dreamed of leaving. I folded clothes without ceremony. Packed the essentials, laptop, toothbrush, the cash I'd stashed in an old makeup bag for emergencies, just like this. I took the photo of me and my grandma from the shelf and left everything else. They could keep the room. Keep the trophies they never asked about, the awards they never attended ceremonies for, the memories they never made room to create. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard my brother shout, "Where's the queso?" Mom called back, "Ask your sister." She was supposed to bring it. My hand clenched the stair rail so tight I thought it might splinter. I didn't say a word. I just kept walking. Right out the door. No one noticed. Not my father, who was too busy arguing over a bad call. Not my mother, who was laughing too hard at someone's Facebook meme on her phone. Not my brother, who only remembered me when the cheese was missing. And that right there, that moment, was the truth I'd been choking on for years. They didn't forget me tonight. They'd forgotten me a long time ago. Tonight was just the proof. I started the car and pulled away from the curb. My gown was still in the passenger seat, draped like the ghost of the life I almost had. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just drove. Into the night. Into whatever came next. Because anything was better than being invisible in a house where I was supposed to be loved. Prom night was supposed to be my redemption arc, the night when all the loneliness, the silence, the years of quiet disappointment would finally collapse under a floodlight of sequins, laughter, and the fantasy that maybe, just maybe, I mattered to someone. But when you walk through the doors alone, when you don't have a corsage wrapped around your wrist or a hand to hold on the way up the stairs, when there isn't a single camera flash aimed in your direction, not even accidentally, you begin to understand that fairy tales aren't missing from your life because they're impossible. They're missing because nobody ever thought you were worthy of one. I had spent 3 weeks altering the dress myself, hand-stitching sequins along the hemline, reinforcing the straps with invisible thread, and tucking the sides in to give the illusion of elegance where none was ever loaned to me by nature. The dress wasn't brand new. It had been folded and forgotten in a clearance bin at a consignment shop, left hanging without pride by someone else's daughter who'd probably been loved enough to afford a real boutique. When I arrived at the school gymnasium, the parking lot was already full of lines of limos and SUV doors swung open like red carpet dreams for people who never looked twice at me in the hallway. I waited inside my car for 15 full minutes, not because I was nervous, but because I was calculating how long I could stand to be overlooked before the silence devoured me whole. The DJ's bass was already rattling the windows. Through the tinted glass, I watched couples hold hands like magnets, watched girls shriek with glee as they posed in glittering clusters, watched boys in suits stumble around like kings in borrowed kingdoms. When I finally stepped out, my heels scraped the pavement with that telltale sound of someone arriving alone, no footsteps to match mine, no voice calling my name, no one waiting to greet me with anticipation. Just the wind, cold and indecent, lifting the hem of my handmade dress and tugging at my curled hair like even the universe couldn't resist taking a piece. The gym doors loomed ahead like some ancient cathedral made of misplaced dreams and overused decorations. Gold streamers twisted in the breeze, framing the entrance with an almost cruel irony, a night to remember. The banner read, but for me, it would become the night I tried to forget for the rest of my life. No one turned when I walked in. Not a single head tilted in curiosity or kindness. It was as though the room swallowed me whole without even noticing the taste. The lights flashed in rhythmic chaos, bouncing off mirrored walls and scattering like fireworks that no one lit for me. Girls swirled past in jewel-toned gowns that rustled like applause. Boys grinned, their arms wrapped around waists with muscle memory shaped by confidence and entitlement. Laughter burst through the music in sudden waves, like distant thunder you weren't meant to outrun. I stood there, inches from the entrance, completely still, like a forgotten statue placed in the wrong museum exhibit. Every part of me screamed to blend in, to belong, to be more than a shadow caught in someone else's highlight reel. I began to walk, slowly, deliberately, across the dance floor. Each step felt like a declaration, a dare, look at me, notice me, just this once. But I was invisible, not in the magical way fairies are or the cinematic way superheroes become. I was the kind of invisible that made people's eyes slide right over you, the kind that turned your voice into background noise before you even opened your mouth. Someone brushed past me and didn't apologize. Another girl's sequined shoulder clipped mine, and she didn't even flinch. The music pounded like a war drum, and I was the casualty no one mourned. I made it all the way across the gymnasium, one side to the other, and not a single person spoke my name. Not a single hand waved in recognition. No one asked where my date was, or if I wanted to dance, or if I needed anything. I could have dropped dead in the middle of the dance floor and they'd probably just step over me on their way to the photo booth. I tried standing near the punch table, pretending to look for someone, hoping maybe a teacher chaperone would offer a strained compliment or that someone would mistake me for a friend of a friend and say something, anything. But all I got was the sting of ginger ale in a red plastic cup and the sharp edge of isolation slicing down my spine. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. No one wondering where I was or what I was doing or if I wanted to meet up afterward. I was a ghost with a heartbeat, wandering a room full of people who'd already written me out of the story. I thought maybe the slow dance would be different. Maybe when the lights dimmed and the crowd pulled close, someone would reach out a hand, if only out of politeness or pity. But as the slow notes of a piano floated through the gym, couples fell into each other like gravity had a favorite. Every pair moved like a spell had been cast, and I stood there, unmoved, unchosen, staring at the sea of silhouettes like I was watching a movie from the wrong side of the screen. My throat burned. My eyes stung. But I smiled. God, I still smiled. Because if I let it show, if I let even a drop of the ache slip out, they'd see me, and not because they cared, but because pain makes people uncomfortable, and I didn't want to give them that kind of discomfort. They didn't earn it. Not tonight. I stayed until the DJ announced the next set would be just for the couples. And that was my cue. That was the moment the hollowness cracked wide open and spilled out like glass from a shattered mirror. I turned, heels dragging against the polished wood floor, and walked out the same way I came in, alone, unnoticed, unclaimed. The parking lot was colder now. The air stung against my skin, sharp and unforgiving. I reached my car without looking back, fumbled with the keys as my hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of trying to hold it all together for one more minute. When I finally got inside and closed the door, the silence hit me like a scream. The gym lights still flickered in the distance, music bleeding through the walls like the laughter of people who never had to wonder if they belonged. And there I was, sitting in a borrowed car, in a dress I'd bled my fingers to fix, crying into my hands like the world had finally admitted I didn't matter. The sobs came quiet at first, then louder, desperate. The kind of cry that lives in your bones and breaks out like a storm when you've been holding your breath for too many years. I didn't care who saw. I didn't care if the whole school looked out the windows and watched me unravel. Because in that moment, I had nothing left to protect. No image to preserve. No mask to wear. I cried because I was tired of pretending that being strong meant being alone. I cried because no one had even taken a picture of me in the dress I'd worked so hard to make beautiful. I cried because it was supposed to be a night to remember, and I'd never stop remembering how it felt to be the only girl no one saw. And as I sat there, tears streaking down my cheeks, mascara staining my skin like bruises I couldn't explain, a thought crept in slow, steady, like poison disguised as clarity. They don't see you, not because you're unworthy, but because they were never meant to. Maybe you were never supposed to fit in because you were meant to stand apart. Maybe you weren't overlooked because you were nothing, but because you were too much for people who only know how to love halfway. So, I wiped my tears, smeared the sadness into something that looked almost like war paint, and I made a promise to myself. If they didn't want to see me tonight, then one day, they would hear me loud enough to never forget. Not through a scream. Not through a scandal. Not through revenge. But through a life built so unshakably strong, so blindingly real, that silence would never swallow me again. There's a kind of silence that follows a cry too big for your chest to hold, the kind that presses against your ribs like a second heartbeat, one you don't remember asking for but can't shake loose. That's the kind of silence I sat in, breathless and red-eyed, behind the wheel of my borrowed car. Mascara drying like war paint on my cheeks while the muffled bass of the prom still pulsed through the gym walls in the distance like the last heartbeat of a dream that died too quietly. I didn't plan it. I didn't sit there thinking through logistics or consequences or what would happen next. I wasn't thinking at all. Not really, not with words anyway. What pulsed through me was older than thought. It was instinct, pure and burning and undeniable. It was survival disguised as impulse, escape disguised as madness. It was the voice I had buried for so long it no longer knew how to speak politely, only how to scream without making a sound. My phone was still sitting on the passenger seat, glowing in the dark like a loaded question. I reached for it, hands trembling from adrenaline and devastation, and opened the browser app like I was possessed by something smarter than me, something that had finally grown tired of waiting for permission to live. One-way flights, I typed, not even thinking of the destination yet. The search bar blinked once, then again, as if waiting for me to lie to it like I lied to everyone else. But not this time. One-way flights. No return. I didn't want round trips. I didn't want options. I wanted gone. I wanted distance that couldn't be crossed with guilt or apologies that arrived too late. I wanted oceans between me and the versions of myself that they had all decided weren't worth remembering. The list loaded slowly: New York, Chicago, London, Dublin. All of them shimmered on my screen like windows into lives I didn't yet own. But when I saw Lisbon, something clicked inside me so loudly I felt it in my teeth. Lisbon. I don't know why. I don't speak Portuguese. I don't know anyone there. I couldn't point to it on a blank map if someone handed me a pen and said, "Find home." But maybe that was the point. Lisbon wasn't where I came from. It wasn't where anyone expected me to go. It wasn't anything. And that made it everything. The flight was 3 days out. One way. Non-refundable. Early morning departure. A window seat. The cost, just under $400. I had saved every cent of my prom budget for months, even while watching the world give other girls things for free that I had to earn through silence and self-erasure. I spent weeks stitching my dress by hand, declining invitations, skipping snacks, walking instead of busing, just to stretch what little I had. I'd been frugal, careful, good. Always good. And now that money was going to buy me something they could never take away. I hit purchase without hesitation. The confirmation screen blinked at me like a dare fulfilled. And that was that. No ceremony. No dramatic music. No angels weeping from the heavens. Just a girl alone in a cold parking lot, quietly buying her freedom while a party full of forgettable moments raged on behind her. I didn't sleep that night. I drove around aimlessly, headlights cutting through the dark like I was carving a new road out of sheer will. I didn't go home. I didn't want to see their faces. Didn't want to answer questions or pretend to be okay or let them think for one more second that their daughter was still safely tucked inside the version of her they'd agreed upon. For the next 3 days, I became invisible on purpose. I moved like a shadow through my own life, packing what I could into a single duffel bag and a small backpack. 1 notebook, 3 pens, 2 pairs of jeans, for shirts, 1 jacket, 1 pair of boots that I had worn so thin the soles were a whisper away from surrender. I didn't take souvenirs. No photos. No keepsakes. Everything from that house could rot in its own silence for all I cared. They didn't deserve a goodbye. I told no one. Not a soul. Not a friend, what few I pretended to have. Not a teacher. Not even the neighbor who once offered me cookies when she thought I looked so tired for a girl my age. I walked the hallways of our home like a ghost, memorizing every creak in the floorboards, every chip in the paint, every detail I knew I'd never miss again. My parents never noticed the duffel bag tucked behind my closet door. They didn't ask why I was suddenly so quiet, or why I skipped dinner 3 nights in a row, or why my bedroom light stayed on until dawn. They were too busy dissecting football highlights, too wrapped up in the sacred tragedy of microwave dinners and middle-class regret. Too eager to complain about taxes, gas prices, and how kids these days don't appreciate anything. 3 nights after prom, at 2 a.m., I slipped out of the house like smoke through a cracked window. The cab waited for me at the edge of the block, engine running, driver yawning behind the wheel like this was just another routine escape from suburban purgatory. At the airport, everything felt surreal, like stepping through a threshold that only opens for people who've lost enough to know what they're willing to risk just to stop bleeding. The TSA agent asked me if I was traveling alone. I nodded. He squinted, checking my ID, probably wondering what kind of 18-year-old flies to Portugal with no luggage worth checking and no one waiting on the other side. He handed it back without a word. Good. I had nothing to explain. Nothing to prove. At the gate, I sat quietly with my backpack clutched to my chest like armor. Around me, families juggled crying toddlers and overstuffed carry-ons. Couples leaned on each other, dozing in shared exhaustion. College students scrolled through TikTok with wild, caffeinated eyes. And there I was, somewhere in between all of them, yet not belonging to any of them. The intercom crackled to life, announcing final boarding. My hands didn't shake. My legs didn't falter. My heart didn't leap or shatter or whisper anything poetic. Because I wasn't afraid. I was finally, irrevocably alive. As the plane climbed into the darkness, I pressed my forehead to the window and stared into the clouds like they owed me something. I watched the city shrink beneath us, its lights flickering like dying stars. Somewhere down there, my name might eventually be spoken with confusion. Maybe even panic. But I doubted it. They'd assume I was sulking, that I'd gone to a friend's house. Maybe they'd be annoyed, maybe relieved. Either way, I would no longer be their responsibility. And that alone made the altitude feel worth it. I didn't sleep on the flight. I watched the world curve beneath us, hours folding into each other, like pages of a story I hadn't written yet. I imagined what Lisbon would smell like, sound like, taste like. I didn't want comfort. I wanted foreign. I wanted strange. I wanted to be the version of myself that didn't have a hometown to return to, just a horizon to chase with blistered feet and unspoken prayers. When we landed, the morning sun hit the windows like a promise kept. I stepped off that plane with nothing but my name, my breath, and a decision that no one could ever undo. I didn't know where I'd sleep that night. Didn't know what kind of job I could find, or if my money would last more than a few weeks. I had no contacts, no safety net, no plan beyond survival. But I had something stronger than a safety net. I had nothing left to lose. And sometimes, that's where the real story begins. The first night in Lisbon, I slept in a 12-bed hostel dorm that smelled like shared shampoo, spilled beer, and freedom wearing thrifted perfume. The mattress was thinner than my patience, the sheets didn't match, and the pillowcase was a shade of gray that might have once been white. But it was mine for the night, and that made it holy. I kept one hand on my backpack while I slept, more out of instinct than fear, because when you grow up being overlooked, you learn to protect what little is yours with the ferocity of a dog raised without fences. The other girls in the room were loud and laughing French, maybe Dutch. One had pink hair that glowed under the flickering ceiling light like a protest. They didn't ask why I was there, which was exactly what I needed. They passed me the Wi-Fi code and a half-finished bottle of cheap wine, then turned back to their stories about boys in Barcelona and drunken tattoos. I listened without speaking. I was still more ghost than girl, more silence than sentence. But something in me softened, just a little. For the first time, no one expected me to explain myself. No one needed me to prove why I existed. I was just another shape in the room, and that anonymity was the first kind of kindness I'd felt in years. The next morning, I walked the streets of Lisbon with holes in my socks and sun on my face. The cobblestones were uneven and cruel to my already blistered feet, but I welcomed the pain like an offering, proof that I had not just escaped, but survived the leaving. Streetcars squealed around corners. Children shouted in a language I couldn't understand. Women in floral dresses haggled over bread and oranges like queens disguised as market vendors. And I was there, eyes wide, lungs burning, heart beating not from fear but from finally, belonging to no one but myself. I didn't have a plan, not in the way adults like to pretend their lives follow blueprints and bullet points. What I had was hunger, the literal kind, and the kind that makes you wake up every morning knowing there has to be more. I needed a job, a place to stay, a way to stretch the remaining euros in my wallet into something resembling a life. Hostel bulletin boards became my compass. Handwritten notes pinned between flyers for pub crawls and yoga retreats. One said, English speaker needed, cafe near Alfama. Cash daily. I tore off the number with hands that didn't stop shaking until I reached the payphone. I lied about my experience. Said I had barista training. Said I'd worked in food service for years. The owner didn't care. He was 62, barely spoke English, and looked at me like I was the latest in a long line of wanderers washed ashore by broken dreams and cheap airfare. He gave me an apron that smelled like garlic and old cigarette smoke and told me to start that afternoon. The cafe was small, wedged between a faded bookstore and a shop that sold handmade tiles no one ever bought. I worked 10-hour shifts clearing tables, serving coffees, mopping floors, and smiling like I wasn't held together by duct tape and desperation. My feet bled. My hands cracked. I earned €5 an hour and half my meals came from leftovers no one claimed. But each time I left with coins in my pocket and the smell of espresso in my hair, I felt taller than I had in years. The first time someone said obrigada to me with a real smile, I almost cried. Not because of the word itself, I barely understood it then, but because someone looked me in the eye and acknowledged that I existed. That I had done something worth gratitude, even if it was just delivering a sandwich on chipped ceramic. I moved from hostel to hostel every week, sometimes every 3 days when bookings got tight. My backpack became my dresser, my bed, my safety deposit box. I kept my journal tucked between shirts like it might leak its truth if left unattended. I wrote in it every night, long entries with no filter, just raw inventory of everything I was unlearning. I stopped using my last name. I stopped checking social media. I deleted every contact from my phone that had never once asked if I was okay when I disappeared. I created space inside myself where I could finally breathe without apology. I learned the difference between being lonely and being alone. Lonely was what I felt at home, surrounded by people who never saw me. Alone was what I felt here, watching sunsets from the rooftop terrace of a rundown hostel with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and the ocean murmuring its secrets somewhere beyond the hills. Alone wasn't absence. It was sovereignty. I made friends I never planned to keep, temporary, beautiful people with laughter like jazz and stories that belonged in paperback novels. A girl named Noor from Morocco taught me how to say, "I'm not lost" in 5 languages. A guy from Finland with too many tattoos showed me how to cook noodles with nothing but a hotel iron and a stolen tea kettle. None of us belonged anywhere. And somehow, that made all of us belong everywhere. I started drawing again, something I hadn't done since middle school art class when my mother said my sketch of a willow tree looked melancholy and asked if I needed therapy. I drew faces I passed on trams, the curve of hills I couldn't pronounce, the hands of strangers wrapped around espresso cups and rolled cigarettes. I wasn't good, not technically, but every line I etched onto paper felt like reclaiming a voice I had never been allowed to use. My body, once something I carried like a burden, began to feel like mine again. I walked miles every day, not to burn calories, not to punish myself, but because the world was finally something I wanted to be a part of. I ate whatever I could afford, whenever I could afford it. I stopped counting. I stopped weighing. I stopped apologizing for being hungry, for being alive. And somewhere between nights spent folding laundry in exchange for a free bed and mornings spent scribbling in my journal at corner cafes, something unexpected happened. I stopped needing them. Not just my parents. Not my classmates or the people who had once called me quiet, dramatic, too serious, too intense. I stopped needing their validation, their approval, their recognition. Because for the first time, I had seen myself outside the reflection they handed me, and I liked the girl staring back. She was tired, yes, worn around the edges, but she was vivid, unedited, loud in her silence, bold in her solitude. She didn't need anyone to tell her she mattered. She just needed to look at her own hands and remember how far they had carried her. I wasn't healed. Healing is not a place you arrive at with a ribbon and a round of applause. It's not a mountain you summit or a race you finish. Healing is walking barefoot across broken glass and learning how to dance anyway. It's bleeding and blistering and getting up the next day because no one else is going to carry your bones for you. But I was whole enough to stop apologizing for the scars. I celebrated my 19th birthday sitting on a stone wall overlooking the Tagus River, eating a melted chocolate bar and sipping wine from a plastic cup. I wore the same boots I'd arrived in, though they now had duct tape wrapped around the toes. I had €5 in my pocket and a belly full of bread and laughter. I was alone. And I was more loved in that solitude than I had ever been in a room full of relatives with my blood and none of my story. I lit a candle from the hostel's kitchen drawer and whispered to the wind like it was the only witness I needed. Happy birthday to the girl who left. And for the first time, I believed it was something worth celebrating. The call came in the middle of a sunlit afternoon, just as I was hanging bedsheets on the hostel balcony to dry in the late spring breeze. The sun was soft on my neck, the linen warm from the washer, and I had just finished making coffee with cinnamon when the phone rang, a vibration more than a sound, buzzing like a warning beneath my fingertips. I didn't recognize the number, but something deep in the marrow of me did. It was the kind of call that doesn't need a name, the kind you already understand before you answer. I didn't say hello. I didn't greet or brace. I just held the phone to my ear and waited for whatever part of my past had finally decided to reach across the sea. Is this? The voice faltered, awkwardly checking a name they probably hadn't said aloud in years. Is this Maya? My real name. Not the one I use now, not the new version etched onto my passport renewal form and written in permanent ink inside my journal. But the name my parents gave me. The name they forgot when the game was on. The name that got drowned out by scoreboards and party guests and silence. Yes, I said, flat and even. My hands didn't tremble. My heart didn't race. I didn't even blink. This is St. Mary's Hospital, the voice said, and everything else blurred into a static hum, the kind that only grief or rage can create. Your father is here. There was a cardiac episode. It's serious. They gave me details I didn't ask for: room numbers, visiting hours, cautions, and conditions. I let the words wash over me, unabsorbed, like rain on a sealed window. When they asked if I'd be coming, I said I'd try. Not because I meant it, but because sometimes it's easier to lie to strangers than to explain how you managed to live without the people who raised you. I hung up, poured out the coffee, and went for a walk. The streets of Lisbon buzzed with life. Children chased pigeons near the fountain. A street musician played something mournful on a cello while tourists passed by without listening. Couples kissed without urgency, hands tangled in the easy intimacy of people who never had to earn love like oxygen. The world didn't pause because someone from my past might be dying. It kept spinning, indifferent and alive. But I stopped. For the first time in over a year, I stopped to consider whether the girl who had run away was ready to look back. Not to return. Not to stay. But to witness the ending of a chapter that still flickered in my dreams. I booked the flight the next morning. It felt different this time, less like escape, more like punctuation. I wasn't leaving behind a version of myself. I was going back to make sure she stayed dead. The airport was familiar in its anonymity. Security lines, coffee queues, stale air and fluorescent lights. But the weight in my chest wasn't fear or sadness. It was resolve. Heavy and earned. I landed just after midnight. The city hadn't changed, not in the ways that mattered. The same billboards loomed over highways. The same gas stations flickered with that half-lit, buzzing neon. The street I grew up on still smelled like wet asphalt and someone else's cooking, a scent forever wedged between nostalgia and nausea. The hospital was quiet when I arrived. Nurses moved like ghosts in soft-soled shoes. Machines beeped with lazy indifference. I gave my name at the front desk and was directed to his room, but I didn't go right away. I sat in the waiting area for a long time, staring at the vending machine, remembering every dinner I ate alone while my father watched games, every night I went to bed without a good night, every when he celebrated louder than he ever praised me. When I finally stood, It wasn't to walk toward his room. It was to walk out the front doors. I took a cab, gave the address like muscle memory, and watched familiar streets blur by in streaks of amber streetlights and memory. My stomach didn't churn. My eyes didn't water. I was beyond grief now, far past it, walking on ground that only the truly broken and rebuilt ever understand. When the cab stopped, I didn't recognize the house right away. It looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was dull, the lawn overgrown, the porch light still flickering like it had when I left. Nothing about it said home, not anymore. It looked like a place that had outlived its own purpose. I stood across the street, hands buried in my coat pockets, the wind pressing against me like it had questions I didn't feel like answering. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just stared, the weight of years pressing down like fog. I had nothing to say to that house. But I had something to leave behind. The letter was in my pocket, folded, creased, and smoothed a dozen times over the past 24 hours. I had written it on hostel stationery the night before, sitting on the rooftop in Portugal with the city lights blinking beneath me and a bottle of wine breathing beside my feet. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an apology. It was a reckoning. I walked to the front door, boots crunching on gravel, the porch steps creaking like they recognized the weight of someone who had finally come back to reclaim what was hers. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't knock. I slid the letter through the mail slot, placed my hand against the door not for connection, but for closure, and turned away. I walked down the steps with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you've said everything that needs saying. In that letter, I told them the truth. I told them that the silence they thought was harmless was actually violence with no bruises. That forgetting my graduation was the first time I died in their house, and pretending not to see me at prom was the second. That every birthday they skipped, every time they remembered the Super Bowl but forgot me, was a cut I had to stitch shut alone. But more than the pain, I told them this. I am not coming back. Not for guilt. Not for closure. Not for the version of you that only remembered me when something went wrong. I have learned to love myself in languages you never cared to teach me. I have made family in strangers and built home from broken things. I have danced barefoot in countries you've never seen and eaten breakfast on rooftops you'll never know. I am not angry anymore. But I am not yours either. Goodbye. I left that street behind like ash on the wind. And I never looked back. The flight back to Lisbon was quiet. I slept for the first half, dreamed of ocean tides and open windows. When we landed, the air smelled like citrus and promise. The hostel was still there, still peeling at the edges, still humming with laughter and music and strangers who might become something more. I unpacked my bag without ceremony, hung my coat on the hook, poured myself a glass of water. No one asked where I had gone, because the kind of people who live with their hands open understand that sometimes you leave just to remember why you came. And me? I went up to the roof, sat under the stars, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had left anything behind. Because the only thing that mattered was this. I had found myself, and I wasn't going anywhere.